Okay, so in this video, we want to quickly review how to sketch the graph of the square root function. But let us first sketch the graph of the square function. So y equals x squared is a simple parabola that passes through the origin. Right, this is the graph of y equals x squared. 0 squared is 0, and as you take the square of larger and larger numbers, the result gets larger and larger and larger, and when you square something negative, it becomes positive, so the graph is perfectly symmetric about the y-axis. Now if you recall, the square root function is the inverse of the square function, and when you have the graph of the original function, you can obtain the graph of its inverse function by reflecting the graph of the original function about the line y equals x. So if you sketch roughly here y equals x, it cuts the first quadrant right down the middle, and this is of course the point 1, 1, right? 1 squared is 1. So let's reflect the two pieces one at a time. So let's first reflect this piece. If you reflect this piece about y equals x, and again think of a reflection as the mirror image, then this will end up going on top. So it will look something like this. And when x goes to infinity, x squared goes to infinity. So as we let x go to infinity, it will also go here to infinity. But this is only half of the reflection, right? If you reflect this piece about y equals x, you obtain this piece. Let's now reflect the other piece, which will look something like this. Now if you look at this, this is the reflected image of the original graph y equals x squared about the line y equals x. So in theory this should be the graph of the inverse function of y equals x squared. But there's an obvious problem here with this. And that is that this is not the graph of a function, right? A function associates for each value of x a unique value of y. But if you take any positive x value, there are obviously two distinct y values. There is the positive y value and then the negative y value. So as this stands, we do not have a function. So what we do is quite simply we make a choice. We choose the positive branch of the square root function. So we call this the square root function, and we ignore the other branch, the negative branch of the square root. So if we only keep the positive part of our curve, then we get a properly defined function. And now we have the graph of the square root of x function being the inverse function of the square function. So if we put them side by side, we have here first the graph of y equals x squared, right? A simple parabola passing through the origin. And if we just peek up the square root, taking again the positive branch, looks something like this. Whereas the initial curve is concave up, because of a reflection, the inverse function is concave down. And this is how you can simply obtain the graph of the square root function from the graph of the square function, simply because the square root function is by definition the inverse of the square function. So to obtain the graph, simple reflection, but again there is a twist. The reflected curve is not a function, and so we ignore the negative branch and only keep the positive branch. And that's it.